Okay, well, thank you all for being here. This is great to have so many. My hope is that, I know you spend all day up in front of people, little kids, no less, teaching them. So hopefully this is a chance to sit back and relax a little bit and just learn some things yourself. But certainly, don't be afraid, to make this interactive. If you have questions, comments, concerns, or disagreements, that's when it gets really interesting, So I definitely encourage, you to be interactive. I know you all know that there's nothing worse than the feeling of trying to teach something and you get all these blank stares and you're like, did they get it or not? So I'll do my best, but yeah, please ask questions and we'll make this interactive. I'll go. I do have a little syllabus of kind of what we're going to be doing. We're going to be diving into Scripture, however, and we're really not going to be looking at a whole ton of verses. But that's because there's so much that's packed into these verses that we're probably not going to have time. In fact, I'm going to make an adjustment, actually. The introductions were great, and I think we needed to do that. But we're going to move the 3:15 part to next week. And one of the things that's going to do is that today is the only passage we're going to look at that's before the fall, before Adam and Eve sinned. And oh, here, you got, sorry. Okay. And that makes a huge difference. That makes a huge difference. Pre-fall and post-fall, okay? So keep that in mind. But that works because then next week, 3:15 is right after the fall. And that changes, what we're going to be looking at.
Please define the fall. I think I know what you mean. But
the fall is when Adam and Eve took the fruit, right, and ate the fruit and sinned against God. We call that event the fall, right? Okay? The way to think of the whole story of the Bible is it's a 3-part story. There's creation, there's the fall, and then there's redemption. The first 2 chapters of Genesis is creation. Genesis 3 is the fall, and the whole rest of the Bible is redemption. God's reclamation project to restore humanity back to that original bliss and holiness that Adam and Eve experienced in the garden. That's the whole story of the Bible in a nutshell. Okay? Now, and so what we're going to be looking at, and I have it lined out there, and you can see on the bottom, this is a picture from this book by Scott Hahn. What we're specifically going to be looking at throughout this Lent is God's covenants with his people, God's promises to his people. And we're going to, since we're Christians, we're going to be looking at how God made promises to all these different figures. You can see them down at the bottom. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David. We're going to look at how God made promises of what he was going to do for his people, and then how Jesus fulfills that and more. And how if we're united to Jesus as his brothers and sisters, we also receive the benefits of all of these promises that God has promised his people. Okay? We're not going to be looking at a whole lot of verses, but that's kind of the big picture story. All right? We're going to be looking at these covenants. Okay? If you want, we're not going to be, this isn't a book study, okay? And I'm not going to be taking everything from this book, but if you want a lot more in-depth, this is a book by Scott Hahn, A Father Who Keeps His Promises. Michaela Niter at Central has some copies of it if you'd like to borrow one. I don't know, maybe we should, if you want, I could bring them next week, but if you want to have this be your Lenten reading, this is going to go a lot more in-depth than what we're going to have time to talk about, but just something to think about because it's the same thing. Scott Hahn's premise of this book is the key to unlock the Bible is to read it through the eyes of covenant. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about what a covenant is, and then we'll get into the verses. Okay, and then the last thing too, another way if you want to go in depth to this topic, this is going to sound worse than it is, but if you type into YouTube Father John Pancrat's Story of the Bible, you can go to my YouTube page. That sounds worse than it is. I want to be a YouTuber now. I know that's like what all your students like want to be now, right?
Yeah.
So for our RCIA at St. Patrick's, I gave a 3-week lecture series on the story of the Bible. And it's largely this same theme that we're looking at, just a little bit different format. And so you're welcome to check that out if you want to go in depth. It was for RCA, but it applies to anybody. So you can check that out if you'd like. If you just, I tested it. If you type that into YouTube, it'll come up. There's 3 parts to it. So, okay. So before we get into scripture, though, I'm just going to briefly describe what a covenant is. First, does anybody know, I guess, what is a covenant? It's a promise.
Kind of like an agreement between God and man, between people.
Yeah, okay. What's the difference between a covenant and a contract? Do you know?
Contracts 50-50.
Not necessarily. What if we go in on a company and I'm 70 and you're 30%?
Let me.
Yeah.
Covenant is 100-100. It's completely give and take, full
Like
Yeah.
a covenant in a subdivision, that's
Yeah.
the law.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
follow that law or you're not welcome in the subdivision.
Yeah. Here's how I would say this is how I would define the difference between a covenant and a contract, okay? A contract is an exchange of goods. I give you this, you give me that. I get 70% of our startup, Nolan only gets 30. Sorry. We have a contract, right? It's an exchange of goods, okay? And then once that contract is fulfilled or over, no problem. We break the contract. It's over. It's a transaction, okay? A covenant, at least in the biblical world, the biblical understanding, a covenant is an exchange of persons. Instead of me giving you this and you giving me that, I give you myself and you give me you. It's a kinship, a blood relationship, where we become much more intimately tied in as a family bond than just a mere contract.
Like a marriage.
Exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm. So what's a covenant that most all? No, I know you're not. What's a covenant that most of you have entered into? Marriage, right? Okay. And in marriage, now with the covenant in general and with marriage, there's certainly contractual elements, right? There's certain legal things with it. But we wouldn't limit it to that, right? We wouldn't limit it to say, well, here, sign the line, and then we join bank accounts, and now we're married, right? When you say vows in a marriage, you're giving yourself to the other person, and they're giving themselves to you, okay? So that's a covenant. Now, not coincidentally, and this is what we'll explore, one of God's primary, I don't even want to say analogies, because it's really what marriage points to, and we'll look at this. What marriage points to is the ultimate marriage between God and his people. There's a reason why he talks about marriage. It's a covenant. It's a family bond. And to break a covenant is like killing a living organism. Whereas breaking a contract or not fulfilling a contract, not as big a deal. Scott Hahn he says the difference for ancient Israel to say they were in a covenant with God, that was like the difference between prostitution versus marriage, right? Something that's purely transactional versus a life that's shared together, full of love and openness and life-giving, right? When they said they were in a covenant with God, it was not just a deal they had with God. It was, we are God's people. We're part of God's family, okay? Now, in the Old Testament, and if you look at the bottom there, and this is what we're going to be looking at, starting today with Adam, is there's 5 times in the Old Testament, and then Jesus, there's 5 times in the Old Testament where God makes a covenant with his people through one of these mediators, okay? And God makes promises to Israel of what he's going to do for them. And then I'm going to spoil the ending because we all know the ending, but as we go through, we're going to look at how Jesus fulfills this and more, right? Because I know you know the end of the story. And then on the last one, we'll look specifically at how Jesus knew that what he was doing was inaugurating the new and eternal covenant that we're still under to this day, okay? So does that make sense with what a covenant is? That's kind of introductory, okay? Right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the first covenant. Now, again, this is the only day that this is going to be the case. This first covenant that God makes with Adam and Eve is before sin, before they fall. All the rest are going to be after sin has entered the world. And that makes a big difference as far as what and how and why God is promising what he's promising. So we're going to look at, so I think the way we'll do this, we'll just read it verse by verse. I'll comment on the verse, and then if there's something that strikes you, or you have a question or an insight or a comment, please feel free to jump in. So the passage we're going to look at is Genesis 1:26 through Genesis 2:3. Now this is at the very end of the creation account. First chapter of the Bible, one of the most important chapters. This is where God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, etc. We're going to look at the end of that passage where God makes a covenant with humanity, with Adam and Eve. All right. So verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." Okay, so the first thing to notice here, and again, we haven't read it, but I know you all know the story. God's created everything, right? The last thing is the most important thing. The last thing he creates is mankind, and he gives them dominion. Dominion. What does dominion mean? It meant that mankind, human beings, were meant to rule God's creation on his behalf. Meant to be stewards, right? Not absolute power as the creator, right? And not God's slaves, but free stewards. You think a good image for this is a garden. That's part of the symbolism of the Garden of Eden. Think about how a garden is both natural and man-made kind of at the same time. And there's a certain harmony there, right? Where a good, beautiful garden is mankind, working with creation, to where it's partly, artificial in a certain way, but it's also natural. And gardens are very peaceful. That's part of what's going on with why Adam and Eve are placed in the Garden of Evil. Garden of Eden. Yeah. They get into the Garden of Evil. Yeah, evil. Yeah. Is that it's this place where nature is in harmony with mankind, right? Mankind has dominion over the earth, okay? So another way to put it, stewards or kings and queens, human beings were meant to be kings and queens who ruled creation on God's behalf. That was our destiny. In harmony with nature. A lot of times now, right, and this is, remember, we're still in the pre-fall world. A lot of times now we're not in harmony with even nature itself, right? But in the beginning, it was meant to be where, like a garden, where there's this harmony between the natural and the man-made. And then the reason why God made us stewards is so that we could then offer creation back to God, right? Now, did this happen? Were we good stewards who offered creation perfectly back to God? No, right? We're not going to read that part, but that's chapter 3 of Genesis. So this is where I'm going to skip to the end, because as we go along, we're going to look at how Christ fulfilled it. Well, we celebrate the feast of Christ the King, right? That's not meant to be just a nice title, like, oh yeah, Jesus is our King, No, what Jesus is doing, he is the new Adam who is fulfilling the destiny of Adam, who was meant to be the steward, the king of creation, to rule it on God's behalf. Where Adam failed, Christ becomes the new king who rules creation on God's behalf perfectly and then offers it back to his Father. Right? One thing, too, he in that way, he fulfills Adam's destiny. As a human being, as a human with a human nature, Jesus fulfills what human beings were meant to be. And an interesting part of that is just how there's a new Adam in the garden, there's also a new Eve. Well, there's a king, but the early church recognized that there's also a queen of the new creation. And we all know who that is, right? Mary, right? Yeah, Mary is the queen. And we'll get into that a little later when we get to David and stuff like that. But so what Jesus and Mary, whose bodies are in heaven right now, that's what we believe, that right now they are the king and queen of creation, doing what our first parents were supposed to do back in the beginning.
Their bodies are there?
Yeah, so Jesus' body ascended into heaven, right? That's in Scripture. And then the Assumption, which is what we celebrate on August 15th, the Assumption is the belief that we have as Catholics that Mary's body was assumed into heaven, and that she is body and soul. There are places that are tombs of Mary, but nobody has ever claimed to have the bones of Mary. Yeah. So, and it's also, I think there's a complementarity there, and we'll get into this in a minute, of how right now there's a male and a female body in heaven. Like, we're both included in, and there's a certain harmony to that, right? Okay. Yeah, so that's just one verse, right? Any comments on that? Or the next verse is even more important, I would say, though. Right? So we got this dominion. Well, we go to verse 27, right? I think this is one of the most important verses in the Bible. And it's one of the foundations of Western civilization. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now, the first thing to point out is in the Hebrew, this is not reflected in the English as well. In the Hebrew, the word man, God created man, it really could be like humankind. In the Hebrew, it's not male. It's the male and female that are the adjectives, which is kind of interesting. So another translation in English could be God created humankind in his own image. Male and female, he created them. Adam, Adam, which is the name we give the first man. Adam actually means basically dirt in Hebrew. Eve means life. So Adam and Eve, it's like, in a way, it's like you need both of them, because what are humans? They're animated dirt. Right? We are dust, right? We got the ashes today. We are dust that has been given the breath of God, given life. We're animated dust. And that's even reflected in the names of Adam and Eve. And in a weird way, like they're both human, but they're also incomplete. You need dirt and life to have a human being. And so that's part of this verse. Not the most important part. I'll get to the most important part in a minute. But that sexual difference is willed by God, and it's a good thing. There's a part that is incomplete if you just have dirt and you just have life. You don't have a human being, right? And that family, this is the family, the union of man and woman, and the family that comes forth from them. John Paul II actually said that this is actually a hint at the Trinity. That man and woman are in their marriage, in their union, are a community of persons that share life and love. That is a reflection of God himself. There's something about God in the Trinity that's not drawn out in this particular verse, but it's hinting at it, according to John Paul II. That God is a community of persons. He is one God, but he's a community of persons with shared life and love. And male and female, there's something about us being sexually differentiated that reflects that reality of God. So that's part of it.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sure, yeah.
I was born and raised Catholic and very devout Catholic.
Yeah.
Well, my mother made us go to church, but that's a whole other story. But no, I chose later on. But anyway,
yeah.
The thing that just resonated with me that was very powerful, and I don't know a lot about the Bible, and I'm a little ashamed, but I also appreciate your interpretation. But, and I finally just sort of listened to the ashes this morning. God, I'm just a mess. Anyway, but now it resonates with me more why when somebody passed that we take the dirt and we throw it on the casket.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Sorry.
yeah.
Having a
No,
moment.
I don't know what they said for you guys, but the one I've been using today is, remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And then we are animated dirt. And
Yeah,
I feel
yeah.
so much better about myself.
You're really
Yeah.
That's nice.
And also, again, too, the other thing that we emphasize as Christians, right, is that the male and the female are adjectives, right? It's humankind is in it. So each of us are in the image and likeness of God. And that's the part, so I want to go back to the beginning of the verse. This is one of the most foundational verses in all of the Bible, but also in Western culture. That we are created that every person is created in the image and likeness of God. One of the things that I think is troubling about our civilization is we take that for granted. But that comes from the Bible. And to the extent that our culture starts to drift away from a biblically founded view of the human person, not all philosophies, not all religions believe that. There are religions, there are philosophies, there are creeds, ideologies, where not everybody is created in the image and likeness of God. There are the haves, the have-nots. There are the superior people, the inferior people, right? And
What do you mean when you say we take that for granted?
I think that our culture takes it for granted that there's that dignity of each human being, but our culture is divorcing itself from the foundation of where that belief comes from. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
That
worship
it comes from here,
God.
right? But our culture, we think like, well, yeah, like, you know, everybody has dignity. Well, but we've lost the faith of where that actually comes from. And we, as a culture, take that belief for granted, I think, to our own peril. That as things go more and more out of control, and we divorce ourselves from the faith, from God who teaches us that, right here in this verse, it's to our own peril. Because not every culture, not every religion in history, not every philosophy has that as a core tenet of what it means to be a human being. And we can see that in our culture, I think, that kind of divorce of the faith where that belief comes from and the dignity of human persons. So what does it mean, though, to be created in the image and likeness of God? The analogy that I like to use is, you think about a quarter. On a quarter, you have the image of George Washington, right? It's a real image of him. It's a reflection of him. But we would never confuse the quarter with George Washington. The quarter is an image of him, not the other way around, right? And then the light, so we're created in God's image, that he has imprinted us with something of himself. So we're not God, but we do reflect him in a very real way, just how that image on the quarter of George Washington is a real image of the man who existed. And then likeness is kind of like, well, you can have the quarter, but that doesn't mean it's always shiny like when it came out of the mint, right? You can mar the image. So to be made in the likeness of God means that we're made for holiness, and we can never lose the image of God. Even after the fall, we still are created in the image of God. But what we can lose, and we have lost, is the likeness. Everybody is created in the image of God, but because of sin, it's like marring that coin, right? To where, yes, it's the image of George Washington, but you can't see him anymore. And isn't that what sin does with us? Everybody has that dignity of being made in the image of God, but in as much as we sin, we dirty, mar that coin, that image that we've been made in. And so I think that's the analogy that I like to use. But the primary way in which we mirror God, or we're made in his image, is through two things that we don't share with other animals, is that we can know in our intellect and we can love with our will. We're capable of love. That's the ultimate way in which we image God. We're capable of love. Now notice, though, that that's kind of a risk on God's part, if you think about it. In creating us, he made a little bit of a risk. He took this dust and said, I'm going to breathe my image, my life into it, this animated dust, But in order to know and to love, you have to be free. So God was taking a bit of a risk. Because has any of you seen Bruce Almighty? You know, there's a scene where he's like, you know, with his girlfriend, he's like, love me, you know, and he's like, and he has the powers of God, right? And she doesn't respond, right? Well, there you go. Like, God, in order for love to be love, it has to be free. So there's a certain risk in God taking this dust of his creation and breathing his life into it and giving us the ability to know and to love. And then that's there you go. That's the crux of the choice that Adam and Eve are given. If he forced them to love them, then they wouldn't really be free. They wouldn't really be created in his image. Right? And we all experience that, you know, like Bruce Almighty, you know, he couldn't force his girlfriend to love him. God can't force us to love him because it wouldn't be love then. Okay? All right. So, again, we'll skip all the way to the end. How does Jesus fulfill this part of God's covenant with Adam and Eve, making them in his image and likeness? Jesus restores the likeness. Jesus, having a human nature, being like us in every way but sin, which is not to say that he's not like us. It's actually to say, well, he actually was what we're supposed to be. He's like us in everything but sin, but the part that doesn't make us what we are. He's like us in every way, but he doesn't have the marred likeness, would be another way to put it. He restores that likeness. And then those of us who are brought into him, into his life, incorporated into him, we have our likeness restored. It's a recreation of humanity, restoring what was lost. And then the other part, going back to the male and female part, there's a verse in John's gospel and also in Mark's gospel. Jesus is known, he refers to himself, and John the Baptist refers to him as the divine bridegroom, as the husband come to save his bride, which is us. That's why God uses this. Like I said, it's not even really an analogy, because marriage is actually the analogy for the way God wants to be wed to us. And Israel repeatedly fails throughout the Old Testament. So Jesus comes and refers to himself as the divine bridegroom come to save his bride. And in a Christian marriage, Christian husbands and wives are meant to be an icon or an image of that love between Christ and his church. So that your marriage is meant to be an image of, it's supposed to be a sign to us about this ultimate reality of Christ coming to save us and to restore us, to restore that what was lost. Right? That's the redemption. Okay? All right. That's verse 2, and we've got 5 minutes. We had the introductions though, so we can do some of this next week. Okay, so now we go to verse 28. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." So, in that second part of that verse, what is the promise? What is he asking of Adam and Eve? Have dominion. Rule creation on my behalf. You're my stewards, you know. That first part, though, this is the first command that God gives to human beings in the Bible. Be fruitful and multiply. Peter Kreeft has finally said, God wasn't telling Adam and Eve to grow orange trees and memorize times tables. What was he telling them? He was telling them to have children, make babies, right? Give life. Take the life that I have given you, and not only have I given you life, but I've also given you the power to procreate, which means to make life with me. And that, to give on the life that you have been given. And we're still in a pre-fallen world. Ideally, in God's original plan, this would have just gone on. Adam and Eve would have given life to their children, who would have given life. part of the reason why we're kind of stuck now in the way that we are is because when Adam and Eve fell, well, what's the life that they could pass on? It was this marred likeness. It was a fallen human nature, right? So, some people sometimes would be like, well, how come we're responsible for Adam and Eve's sin? It's like, well, because we're their sons and daughters. We're descended from them. They could only give us what they had, meaning we don't exist if they hadn't passed on whatever they had. There was no scenario where, we exist in some, separate human tree, They could only give us what they had. And originally they were supposed to pass down to us this holy and blessed life. But instead it was a fallen life. And so, again, this is the first, remember.
And so you're saying we are responsible for them having fallen?
No, it's more that because they could only give us what they had, that's what makes us why we are where we are today. Like, the way I think is, like, Adam and Eve fell in a pit, and they can only have babies at the bottom of the pit, right? Meaning, like, there's no scenario where, there's more humans being created on the top. In order to be a human being, you're in the pit now. You can't give what you don't have. And once they fell, they could only give us, their children, a fallen human nature. Now, God could have, and he talks about it in different parts of the Bible, he could have said, I'll start over. But then that wouldn't be us. That would be some other race, species, family, right? We're the son, as C.S. Lewis's phrase, we're the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve, right? And they could only give us what they had, right?
So can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go
and
ahead.
I don't want to make this sound awkward.
Yeah.
I know we just have a couple minutes, so
Yeah.
good luck with this. But
Yeah.
so and it's me, of course, asking the question. So with all due respect, so if we're made to procreate and
Yeah.
produce life, why are people in the faith as priests and
Yeah.
why are you asked to be celibate?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple ways you can answer that. First of all is in the new covenant, right? In Jesus's, right? There is Jesus says that there are some who are, he actually says eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom, literally. So part of it is that in the new covenant, right, some are called to imitate Jesus in that way, right?
Okay.
As priests or as men or women religious, right? So yes, but it's only after Jesus comes that celibacy and virginity really makes sense. Before then, it's like, it doesn't make sense. Now, Thomas Aquinas does talk about, do we all have to fulfill this commandment, right? And basically his answer is that it's a commandment to humanity, and me not having children is not, we still are able to fulfill that commandment, even if some are set aside to be celibate for the kingdom, right?
Okay.
And it's not that those things are in competition with each other, because so it's an imitation of Christ, but celibacy or virginity is also a sign of heaven, because ultimately earthly marriage is for this life, but all of us in the end will be married to Christ as the church. And so my life is meant to be a sign that, yes, marriage and family life are good, and this commandment of God is good. Pre-fall, also remember that.
Pre-fall, yeah.
But there's something higher that we're all called to in the end, right? And that's our marriage. The reason why there's no marriage in heaven is because there's only one marriage. There's a marriage between Christ and his bride. You won't love your spouse less. You'll love them even more in a way that you can't now, because you'll love them in and through God. You'll have access to a higher kind of, it's not that your love will be annihilated, it will be raised to a higher pitch that is not possible until we're in heaven, right? That's a good question, though. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And like I said, part of it is, too, is this is also, again, pre-fall, right? So,
right.
So there's after the fall, and then after Christ, there are some who he calls to forsake marriage. And not because marriage is bad. right? You can't sacrifice bad things. So I didn't forsake marriage because it's a bad thing, or even because I didn't want to get married
Right.
in a certain sense, but because it's a good thing,
Oh,
right? So yeah, that's a great question. It's not awkward. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
No, thank you.
No. Okay, last point, and then we'll finish the rest of this passage next week. But so be fruitful and multiply. Again, this is pre-fall, but even post-fall, sex is good. Sex was created before the fall. Sex and marriage and family and life, right? This was all before the fall. Yes, through sin, it's been marred. And we all know, we've all had experience with where, particularly when it comes to our sexuality, it's a hang-up for us because we just can't quite get back to this pre-fall state that it was supposed to be, right? But it's fundamentally good. Right? There are some groups throughout history, like Christian groups, puritanical type group, that the body's bad, sex is bad. No, not at all. Not in the biblical account, right? And not in, it's good. It's just the challenge is that we struggle to experience it in in its original goodness and holiness, right?
Okay, yeah.
But God is the God of life. And he not only gave Adam and Eve life, he also gave them the ability to create new life. So, think about and even to this day, think about all the things that you can do with your life. But when you have children and you raise children, that child will live for eternity. You can, create a bunch of great widgets or whatever, but they're not going to last, at least past the second coming, They probably won't even last past the lifetime warranty, right? But your children have souls that will last forever. You with procreating with God in and through your children, have with God created someone that will last for eternity. And what greater power is that? What greater gift is that, right? And so lastly, Jesus, how does Jesus fulfill this? Well, Jesus, and this also points to what you were talking about, Gemma, that Jesus, through his bride, the church, a husband and wife give natural life to their children. Jesus, through his bride, the church, gives supernatural life, eternal life. So part of the reason why I'm called to be celibate is not because I'm, a bachelor. It's because my life is united. I'm married to the church. And through the church, part of my job as a priest is to give eternal life to your all children who you've given natural life, right? So even, and you call me father, right? Because there's a spiritual fatherhood. So it's not that it's like marriage and sex, it's that after Jesus, right, there's a different dimension that's opened up in terms of giving us eternal life. And some, both men and women, are called to start living that life now in service of everybody else, not for me, myself, and I. So even in my life, there is a husband-father dimension, but it's to the church and it's to my spiritual children, not to my natural children, right? So that's part of what's going on. And then how does Jesus give us his life? Last point, I promise this is the last point. is through the sacraments, right? Primarily. Not exclusively, but primarily. When Jesus says, "This is my body given up for you," well, what does a husband say to his wife? Even on their marriage, on their wedding night, "This is my body given up for you." Right? And again, it's the union between man and woman and that love that they're called to image between Christ and the church. Marriage is an image of Christ and the church, not the other way around, right? And so when Jesus says, "This is my body given up for you," that's the same thing that husband and wife say to each other. Now, again, in the post-fall world, do we fall short? Absolutely, right? That's why marriage is a sacrament. Because Christ knew that to live this kind of love is naturally speaking, darn near impossible, right? To have a sacramental marriage as a Christian married couple, you're going to need the grace to image this perfect union of Christ in the church. All right. There's more to this one, but we'll go into next week. We did the introduction, so yeah. Any final thoughts, questions, concerns?
Wow.
That we only got through
Yeah.
three verses, so.
Yeah, I was saying, I need you to go through the whole Bible with me.
Yeah.
It makes sense now.
And like I said, if you want to get into more of these themes, the YouTube videos for RCA and the this book, if you want to borrow that book, there are copies of it at Central. You can make that your Lenten reading but we'll finish this next week.
Thank you.
Then we'll get into, we're not going to go through the fall, but we're going to then start talking about, okay, now that we're fallen, now that we've sinned, what next? What's the reclamation project? How are we redeemed? Are we redeemable?